Alright, so we have implemented all of the layers. We've also implemented the get CRUD operation. Now in this video, we need to finish the rest of CRUD operation and also handles any error that come up. So we'll implement the post, put, and delete mapping. As you can see here, we're only just fetching the all to-dos, but we're not handling errors. What happens when there is no list of to-dos? Let's say our database table is empty. So in that case, it will return an empty to-do list. So we also need to handle those error cases as well. So in this video, I'll show you how we can do that. So go to your to-do package and create a file, and this file will be a CL class and response. Call it a response. CL class in Kotlin defines a set of subclasses inside it. CL class are used when it is known in advance that a type will conform to one of its subclasses, and this ensures type safety by limiting this class or defining a set of limit types. By defining this set of classes, we know what to expect. For example, when we send a request, the response would be two types. Either we get a success response or we get an error response. And we want to be able to handle those two cases, right? So that's why we created a CL class so that we could respond to those two types of responses. We're also gonna make this response class to work with many data types. So we are going to generalize our response. So we're gonna work with generics. Generics in Java is working with many data types. Generics, in simple term, is to make one class to work with many data types. For example, if you go to here, the list, this list, if we click on it, is generic. It works with many data types. We could have list of string, list of integer, list of double, many things, list of object, right? So we are gonna make our response to also work with many data types. To do that, we'll make it T, a generic. You could name it whatever you want, type or data, right? But T is convention, so we'll work with that. We'll just keep it T. Let me actually disable GitHub data class and then success. This success will work with, so once we receive a success, we'll get the data. So this data would be T, and we return a response of T. Also, we will create a data class of error, and this error just takes error, and file, and this error would be string. So we'll just return the error type response of T, and we'll just return the data type of that. What are we getting? T is unknown. So yeah, sure. So let's make this success object as a T, and also error, we're also gonna make it generalized. So now, just like that, our response class could work with many data types, and I'll show you how to work with this response in the next video. Okay, so now we define a response that works with many data types. Now let's work with it. So go to to-do service. Now we're gonna change these to-dos to not only return list of all to-dos, but also to handle errors, and if there's an error, to also return that error as well. So in order to do that, we're gonna change the data type to response entity of a type response, and the type of this response would be a list of to-dos. I'll to-do, then we'll do to-dos repository, find all to-dos, and now we'll use when. So when is same as switch in Java, so we say to-dos that is empty. So if to-dos is empty, we need to return an error. So we return response entity not found. Otherwise, else we will return response entity that's okay, and we will give response that success and pass in the data type, which would be to-dos. Just like that, and we will just return this. It says that okay, so we'll just return that request dot body, and the body would be response that error, and we would pass in not found. I'll make this string, no to-dos found. Alright, so let me minimize this. Alright, so we have no to-dos found. So if let's format this. So now what we're saying is that we are returning a response entity of a type of response, and this response has a type of list of to-dos, right? We fetch data from our database, and we check if there's nothing in our database, then we return no to-dos found. Otherwise, we return this. Just like that, now we're able to handle error. So now if we go back to our to-do controller, now in order for us to use or to handle the error case from the client side, we need to do it like this. So we would have, we'll get rid of this. Now we will get the response. So we'll create a response, and then we'll say to-dos dot get all to-dos. So if you look at this get all to-dos, this returns a response of entity of a type response of a type list of to-dos. So once we get this, we need to go through all of the responses. So we can say response dot body. So our body would be a response of list of to-dos. So in that body, we have to check is. So is another keyword which checks if the body is of a type success or error. So we could say is response is success. If the response is success, then we will return response dot body dot data. Now it is complaining So we would have to cast something. So response as response.success. I guess we have to map our response body to success and then get the data from there. Let me minimize this now. Alright, so that is that. Otherwise, if it is response that's error, if the response is error, then we need to get the message. So message would be we have to do something. So we have to cast. What we're doing is we're casting the body as response response dot error, and from there we are getting the error message. And now we would have to return throw. We would have to throw an exception and say could not get to all to-dos, and then error. And now we just pass in the error message. Otherwise, if that is not the case, then we would have to just else. If it is unknown for some reason, we have to throw an exception as well, because it could be something else. So unknown error occurred. Let me correct that, and then error. Now from here we could get the response dot status code. So we'll just pass in the response status code, and just like that we are able to handle error. Now we could actually optimize this as IntelliJ is suggesting. So we could lift out of the return type from here and just do like that. So now we could optimize our code to make it more easier to read and understand. So to walk you through the code, what we're doing is we are fetching all to-dos, and now we are checking the response. If the response was success, then we return the data, which is of a list of to-dos. If there was an error that occurred, then we get the error message out of this error object, and now we throw to not get all to-dos for this error message. For some reason, if it is not these two, then it could be a unknown error, and we don't know. The response could have been maybe we get invalid URL, or the user doesn't have a permission to get access. For any reason, we have to handle that case as well with the status code. So just like that, we're able to handle this error code. Now, from now on, we'll continue doing this with the rest of the CRUD operation as well. Alright, so actually we missed a case. Right now we're only handling these two cases, but we also need to handle the unknown case in our to-do service. So in here, so right now we're only handling the case it is empty, but we also handled the case where we get a valid response and the unknown case, because anything could go wrong. The server could be down, right? So in here we could do to-dos dot size. If it is greater than 0, then we could just return this response success, because we know we have a list, one item in it. Otherwise, if it is not these two cases, then we have to return unknown case. So we'll just send we'll send a bad request, and then we'll say unknown error occurred. That's it. And now back to our controller, we sent an exception error with the status code if it is not success or error. And now go ahead and restart your server. Okay, our server has started successfully. So now let's go to Postman. So in Postman, let's send a query. We get the result. Now if we go back to IntelliJ and open your projects, go to your to-dos, and let's comment this out for now. And let's restart our application. So now we should receive an empty list. Our application restarted. Now let's go back to Postman, send a request. Here we get an error, did not get all to-dos, error, no to-dos found. So now we are handling the case where there is nothing on our database and we are returning the correct error message. So now if we go back here, so that's good. Next, let's go back to service, or let's go to our controller and let's implement post. Alright, so now that we created our get method, now let's create our post mapping method. So what we'll do is we'll create another annotation called post mapping, and we map this post to /create, and then we'll create a method called create to do, and this method will take one parameter, and that parameter would be request body to do, and then to do object. This post mapping will handle our HTTP post request on this URL, and so when we hit this URL to create a to-do, this URL will then transform into a HTTP post request, and this post request takes a at request body. This request body, what it will do is when we attach an object to our URL, it will transform that object into a domain object, and that object, when we need it back, then it will do the serialization and deserialization of that object. So this annotation would handle all of that for us. So when we go to our endpoint, this endpoint, and we create a body with it, so raw and then JSON object. So when we send an object, for example, title, and then our to-do title and description, to-do description. So when we send this object, the add request will take this object and transfer it to a domain object, which is a to-do object. So that's what this add request is doing. So after that, we'll create a variable, call it response, and this response will be the return of our to-do service. So we'll call create to-do method in our service, and we pass in a to-do object, and this method should return a to-do object. So this method is not created yet, so let's create it in our to-do service. Let's implement this method. This method will return a response entity of response, and this would be to-do object. So we'll return a to-do object once we create, just so we can see on the URL that an object has been created. So first we need to validate before we create. So step one is validation. We need to validate before we insert an item. So to do that, we will first check if to-do exists. To-do exists. So we'll do to-do service dot find by ID to-do dot ID. So if to-do exists, then we don't want to create another object. We need to let the client know that, hey, this to-do object already exists. So we cannot create an object with this ID. So we'll use when. As you know, when is equivalent to switch in Java. So we check if to-do exists. So if the ID already exists, then we need to return an error. So we'll do return response entity bad request, and then we'll pass in a body, and that body would take response dot error, and we pass in, let me minimize this, and this would be with ID ID already exists. We don't want to create a to-do object which its ID already exists. Alright, it is complaining. What is it complaining? Okay, I guess we just need to return here, and then that should fix it up. Now we also need to validate that the response title or the description are not empty as well. So we could also say to-do dot title. If the title is blank, if it is empty, then we also need to throw an error. So I'm just gonna copy this, and then I'm gonna put it on here, and I'm gonna say the error would be to-do cannot be empty. I guess we could just say title. Title cannot be empty. We also have to do same thing for the description as well. So we'll say description, and then we'll just say description. Also, description cannot be empty. Otherwise, we have to check if to-do. So if the to-do is not present, we know that we can create a new object of to-do, right? So everything is validated. So if everything here is good, and our to-do does not exist, then we'll return response entity OK body, and then the body would be response that success, and then we'll just save the data. So to-do repository.save and to-do object. I hope this makes sense. Otherwise, if anything else goes wrong that we don't know, then we could just throw an error. Guys, anything could happen. Our server could be down, so we could just say unknown error occurred. Unknown error occurred. If our server is down, if we cannot create a to-do object for some reason, then we'll send this unknown error. I hope this makes sense. So let's go to our to-do controller now. Okay, now that we have a response, now we can pretty much do the same thing we did on here. So we can copy it, and we could paste it on here. It's literally same code. Right now, yeah, it is complaining about copy pasting, so there's a duplication. So you can leave it as it is, or you can refactor it. And the best thing we can do is refactor it. So let's go on, highlight all of this, and then right click, go to your refactor, and then let's refactor a function. There we go. So it refactored for us. Now we can also do something here. We can also return to-dos. Yeah, let's call it to-dos. And then let's pass a response. Right now it is complaining because it is asking us to, it requires a list of to-dos, but it is found to do. So what we need to do is we need to make this function a generic. So we need to create a generic function out of here so it returns what we need. In order to do that, we could generalize this method by returning a type of t so that it returns the object we need rather than just returning to do all the time. So in order to make that happen, we could just return, we could make this a t and this returns a t type. Just like that, now everything is working as expected. So this method will return a to-do object, and this method will return a list of to-do objects. Just like that. Alright, so let's restart our server and let's test to make sure everything is working as expected. Okay, so our server started successfully. So let's go to our Postman and let's create a collection actually. We'll create a collection. We'll name this collection To-dos APIs. To-do APIs. Okay, so inside this collection, we will group all of our API testing in one place so that it is easier for us to work with it. So first one, we'll create get to-dos, and the endpoint will just be localhost get. So let's send a request. Now we are getting all of our to-dos. Now let's copy it. So click on here and then Command D. And now let's rename this to add to-dos or create to-dos. Let's rename this to a create a to-do. Now this would be localhost 8080. In the start of get will be create, and our body will give in a row, and the format would be JSON. And let's create this too. Let's get this from here. Go to your create to do API and paste it on here. Let's format. Alright, so let's get rid of that comma at the end, and then to do create to do one, and then let's just say create to do description. So now we are gonna send a request. We receive a bad request. The method request method get not supported. So we made a mistake. So instead of get, we have to change this to post. Let's change that, and now let's send a request. There we go. Our to-do object created successfully. And now let's go to get to-dos API. Right now we have 3. to-dos. Now let's send a request. Now we have 4 to-dos. Also, let's test our error handling. So let's also create a to-do with this ID. And let's send a request. Now it says that cannot get all to-dos, error with ID 4 exist. We're getting the right, we're handling the error, but we're showing the wrong information, right? So let's go back to here. So let's create a generic error handling message as well. So for now, let's just say something happened with to-do operation, CRUD operation. Now we'll just leave it like that for now, and then we'll just print the message. So let's restart the server. Okay, our server started. Let's go create a new to-do without any IDs. Okay, it is created. Now let's create with ID 4, which already exists. Now we get something happen with to-do CRUD operation error. To do with ID 4 exists, right? Now let's say we try to create a new to-do object, but the title is empty. Let's see what happens. Something happened. Title cannot be empty, so we're handling the error messages correctly, and our method works as expected. And get to-dos also works, right? So everything is working as expected. Next, we'll implement post mapping. Okay, we have built our post mapping to create a to-do object, and that is working successfully. So now let's create post mapping. So whenever we want to update or modify or make changes to our to-do objects, we need to use post mapping. Post mapping is very similar to post mapping. In post mapping, we're saying that the HTTP request has a post mapping where we pass in the ID of the object we're trying to modify and the data we want to change into. So we'll create a post mapping, and we need to map a URL to this post mapping, and that URL will be update. And we're also going to pass extra data along when we send this request, and that data would be the ID of the object we want to update. Okay, now we'll create a function which is update to do, and this function, as I mentioned, would take 2 parameters. The first parameter would be the ID, and this ID is of a type long, and this ID will come from our URL, the path of our URL, right? So when we want to update an object, we also want to pass the ID of that object. And to get the ID from the URL path, we have to use annotation of path variable. So this path variable will fetch the ID from this URL. And we also need to use to do, which is of to do object. Let's actually rename this to do data. So this would be the data the user wants to change into, right? So this data would also get attached to this URL as a body. So we have to use @request body, because when we send this URL, we're also sending this data along with it. And this request body, what it will do is just transform this data into a domain object, and it does the serialization and deserialization of the objects. And when we want to insert, it will insert the right data, and this is what this request part is doing for us. Okay, Now what we'll do is we'll just create file response, and this response would be to do service dot update to do, and we'll pass in the ID, and we'll pass in the to do data, right? And this function also returns a to do object as well, and we'll use our to do's to return us the object we need. Actually, let's rename this to to do resolver. We'll just rename this to do resolver, and we'll just return to do resolver, and we pass in the response. That's all we need to do. Now let's create this method inside of to do service. Here we go. This is created for us. Now let's actually start implementing our updating, the logic of updating. So in order to do that, let's annotate this function as transactional. So this transactional is an annotation which will take care of doing the JPL query and updating the right values in the right column in the right database. So there's a lot of things happening behind the scene, and the reason why we have to use this annotation is because in our to-do repository, so in this repository we are extending from JPA repository. By default, JPA repository does not implement the add transactional, so we had to add that annotation to our method so that when we're doing the updating and stuff, JPA will query the right data. If you don't want to use that annotation, we can use the CRUD operation. If we use this CRUD operation, then this annotation becomes unnecessary. We don't need to add that. So either way, you could use either the CRUD repository or the JPA repository. For us now, I'll just go back to our JPA repository. So we'll stick to that for now since we started using it for this video, and I'll just use a transactional to mark this method as a transaction so that JPA will do the updating for us, and all we need to do is just overwrite the data using the setter and getters, and that will take care of the rest. Okay, so let's do the logic. So first, let's get the ID. So to do ID, and we could do that by doing to-do's repository find by ID and passing the ID. Actually, let's rename this to do exist. So we have to check if the to-do item that we want to update exists. If it exists, then we can update. So let's use when. So to do dot is present. So let's actually check if it is not present. So if the to-do doesn't exist, then we need to return an error. So let's just copy this and just return that and say to do with ID $sign to do data.id does not, actually let me do it in this here, does not exist. Let's also do return here as well. Before we update, we can also validate our to-do data as well. So we could also say, we could actually do something here. Let's do something, and let's just use to-do data and to-do data. So we have covered all of these cases. So if it is not any of these cases, then we know we do have a valid data to actually update. So let's get to do data. Let's create a local variable, call it to do, and then we'll use to do exist dot get data, right? This will get the data we need from our to do object, right? After that, we will create another variable to be updated, and this, what it will do is it will take the to do object that we'll use copy with. We'll just copy the title with to do data dot title and description, and then we'll just do to do data dot description. That's all we have to update, because we're just updating the title and the description, and after that we save this object. So let's go ahead, let's actually copy this whole thing, and let's return this with the to be updated data, just like that. So let's run down all of this logic again. So if the to-do item that we are trying to update, if it is exist, we fetch the original, let's actually call this original to do. So we'll get the original to do from our database, and now that object will just update the fields we want to update with our to do data. So remember, this to do data is coming from the client side, what the user wants to change. So we'll just copy those data into our original object, and we'll create a local variable out of it, and that is the data we will save. I hope that makes sense. Else, we'll just throw an else statement here. Just so this else will be unknown error. Okay, so just like that, we are done updating our to do. So let's run our server now. Okay, now that our server started successfully, let's go to Postman, and now let's go create a to do. Okay, to do is created. Now let's fetch a to do. Now everything's getting fetched. Now let's actually copy this and let's create another API testing, and now this would be update to do, and this would be put and localhost 8080 and update, and let's update this ID. Let's update the first one, ID 1, and let's update this to an object, and let's actually just update the titles, and let's say let's format this. Okay, so now that it is formatted, let's say finished working out, updated description, something like that, and let's send a request. Now we have successfully updated. Now let's fetch our to-dos, and let's check the ID 1. Look, it is getting updated right now. What it's doing is that for each time we update a data, it adds to the end of the list. We could leave it as it is for now, and later on, maybe in another video, we can also sort them out. But right now, it is getting updated. So now let's also test to make sure our error handling is also working. So let's update an ID that don't exist, 9. With this, what do we get? Something happened with to-do CRUD error, to do with ID 0 does not exist. Okay, that doesn't make sense. Let's go back, let's fix it up. Actually it would be this ID. Sorry, we're not using this ID. So it would be the ID of the data we are trying to update. My bad. So now let's restart our server. Server restarted successfully. Let's go back to Postman. And now let's try to update an ID that doesn't exist. Right now, yes, here we go. It is now showing the correct message. So to do with ID 8 does not exist. Let's try to update an empty title. Okay, let's try to update the right to do object with the right ID. And now let's try to update with an empty title. Now we're getting title cannot be empty. So everything works as expected. The last thing we're gonna do is delete mapping. Alright, so let's do the last CRUD operation. So the last one is pretty easy. In order for us to delete things from our database, we could use delete mapping, and this would map to, let's say, delete URL with the ID of the item we want to delete. And now we'll just say fun delete by ID. We are gonna delete by ID, and the only thing we need is just a path variable from our URL, and then this function will tell us whether the item was deleted successfully or not. So let's use add path variable ID, and this ID would be long, and this function will return boolean, true or false. All we need to know is whether the item was deleted or not. So if the item was deleted, we need to return a true. If the item was not deleted or something happened, then we need to return a false. So that's all we need to do. We'll just create a local variable. So let's call it response, right? And then we'll just say to-dos repository dot delete by ID, and we pass in the ID, and we'll just return to do resolver with the response, and this will return either true or false. So let's create this function. So create a member variable, and here we go. This function is created for us, and now all we need to implement is just a delete by ID. So let's implement the logic of deleting an item from our to-do repository. So let's check if the item exists. So to-do, and let's use to-do repository, and there's an API called exist by ID. As you can see, this will return a boolean, either true or false. So we pass in the ID. Okay, so now we'll say if the to-do doesn't exist, then we'll just return this. So response, we'll just return this error saying that to-do with this ID does not exist. So return. Otherwise, if we do have an item we can delete, then we'll just return a response entity.OK, and that the body would be response.success, and we just pass in true, just like that. Otherwise, if anything else happens that we are not sure of, we'll just return a known error, just like that. I hope this makes sense. And now if we go to our to-do repository, everything is good. Now let's test to make sure we're able to delete an item. Okay, our server started successfully. Let's go to Postman. Let's create another API. Let's rename this to delete to do, and this will be delete. And let's get our localhost. What did we call this? We call delete with the ID. So delete, and let's actually delete ID 1. So let's send a request, and let's delete ID 1, and let's send a request. That means item with ID 1 has been deleted successfully. Now let's send a request. Okay, we made a mistake. The item is not getting deleted, so let's fix that. Let's go to delete by ID, and actually we are not deleting, we're just returning true. So let's fix that up. Let's actually say to do repository delete by ID. Yeah, let's use this delete by ID, and let's pass in ID, and let's return success after that. So if the item exists, we delete it by its ID, and we return true after. Let's restart the server. Okay, server restarted successfully. Let's go to Postman, and now everything's working. Okay, so now let's delete. So now we return true. Item has been deleted successfully. Now let's get to-dos, and now to-do with ID 1 is not there anymore because it has been deleted. And let's see, let's delete an item that doesn't exist. So what do we get? Yeah, to-do with ID 5 does not exist, which is good. So we're also doing our error handling successfully. And guys, we have successfully implemented all of this CRUD operation. We've implemented get to-dos, create to-dos, update to-dos, and delete to-dos. Okay, so I will leave you with a challenge. So the challenge is we need to set to-do done. So for example, this to-do is set to done. So I created an endpoint, and then we could set ID2 done. Now it is set to true, and now when we fetch those, item with ID2 is done. So the challenge is, can you implement this endpoint? And if you can, let me know.